Hello, my friend, and welcome to the Sleepy Scholar. Tonight we turn toward something strange and old, a place where chemistry was still dreaming, where rock and metal and starlight had not yet been separated into science and story. Tonight's subject is alchemy and the ancient earth that gave it birth. Think of it as a single, slow breath taken by the whole planet, held for 4.5 billion years, and alchemy as the faint, curious whisper humanity made when it finally noticed that breath. Not a subject to master, not a test waiting at the end of the lesson, just a long, low hum of wonder, the kind you can rest inside of. You may have had a long day. Perhaps your mind is still turning over conversations, tasks, small worries that seem larger at night than they ever do in daylight. That's all right. You don't need cosmic mysteries to fall asleep, and you don't need sheep either. You just need somewhere soft to place your attention while your body remembers how to let go. That's what tonight is for. There is nowhere else you need to be. Nothing here needs to be understood, followed, or remembered. We'll wander gently through old laboratories and older rocks, through gold seekers and ocean formers, through symbols and stone. And if you drift off in the middle of a sentence, that sentence will have done exactly what it was meant to do. If these gentle journeys help you rest, you're welcome to like or follow wherever you're listening. It only helps other sleepy souls find their way here too, to a place where their mind can finally stop reaching and simply settle. Now, before any of the story begins, let's take a moment just for your body. Let your shoulders soften, just a little, right where they are. You don't need to move to do this. Just imagine them growing heavier, sinking slightly, the way sand settles after a wave has passed over it. Let your jaw unclench. Let your tongue rest low and loose in your mouth. Let your eyes, even if they're already closed, soften further, as though they too are sinking into the dark. Let your breathing slow down, not by forcing it, but simply by noticing it, in and out, and in, a little slower each time, like a tide easing toward low water. You don't need to remember anything I say tonight. You don't need to follow the thread all the way through. Nothing here is a test, and nothing will be asked of you afterward. If your mind wanders, that's not a failure. That's exactly what a tired mind is supposed to do. So let your body soften, let your mind loosen its grip, and let's begin to wander gently, unhurried, into a very old story about gold, fire, rock, and time. Long before anyone tried to turn lead into gold, the earth itself was busy turning almost nothing into everything. Picture a wide, spinning cloud of dust and gas drifting slowly around a newborn sun. Within that cloud, tiny grains of rock and ice began to touch and cling and gather, the way lint gathers in a pocket, slowly, patiently, over millions of years. Those tiny gatherings became pebbles. The pebbles became boulders. The boulders, crashing gently and then not so gently into one another, became a planet. this happened around 4.5 billion years ago, a span of time so long that if you tried to count it in seconds, you would still be counting long after your body had turned to dust and returned to soil. It's not a number meant to be understood. It's a number meant to be felt, the way you feel the weight of a thick blanket without measuring it. The early Earth was not the blue and green place you know. It was closer to a slow-motion furnace, glowing dull orange and red. Its surface, a shifting sea of molten rock. There was no ground to stand on yet, only heat finding its way toward balance. And yet, improbably, patiently, that molten world eventually cooled enough to form a crust, a thin skin over impossible heat, the very first skin the planet ever wore. You are made from that first act of gathering. Every atom in your body once drifted, unformed, in that same ancient cloud, waiting quietly for something to become. But that is only one small part of the story. The word alchemy carries a hidden geography inside it, if you listen closely. It traces back to an old word, chem, which meant something like the Black Land, a name the ancient Egyptians used for the dark, fertile soil left behind each year when the Nile flooded and receded. Not black as in burnt, but black as in rich, as in full of quiet potential, the color of soil that knows how to grow things. So woven into the very name of alchemy is a memory of a river, flooding and retreating, leaving behind dark earth ready to hold new life. The practice that would eventually chase gold and immortality was, at its root, named after mud. There's something tender in that. All that longing for gleaming metal, for eternal life, for transformation. And underneath it, quietly, a word about soil. About the ordinary, dark ground that makes anything grow at all. Early alchemists in Alexandria, working in workshops thick with smoke and metal vapor, likely didn't think of themselves as founding a discipline. They thought of themselves as continuing something ancient, dyeing, metalworking, embalming, all the practical arts of transformation that Egypt had practiced for millennia, now wrapped in new layers of philosophy borrowed from Greek thought. When you next feel far from where you started, remember that even the word for transformation was born from a river, returning gently to itself, leaving something dark and rich behind. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. The very first 1,000,000 years of Earth's existence are called the Hadean, named, fittingly, after the underworld. Scientists chose that name because for a long time they imagined this era as truly hellish. A molten surface, no oceans, an atmosphere thick with poison gases, asteroids raining down without pause. Picture, if you can, a world with no calm shoreline anywhere, no gentle tide, nothing green, nothing that breathes. Just heat and impact and slow settling. A world learning the hard way how to hold still. And yet, this is the quiet twist. Newer evidence suggests the Hadean may not have been quite so hellish after all. Tiny crystals preserved from that time hint that liquid water may have existed far earlier than anyone expected, small pools of calm, even inside the chaos. Isn't that a strange comfort? That even during what we assumed was the most violent chapter of the planet's life, there may have been quiet water somewhere, catching starlight, simply existing. Your own difficult chapters may hold small pools like that too, moments of stillness you didn't expect, tucked inside something that looked, from the outside, like nothing but heat. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. At the very heart of alchemy sat a dream so simple it could fit in a single sentence. That lead, the dull, heavy, common metal, could somehow be coaxed into becoming gold. To modern ears, this can sound like superstition or greed dressed up as science. But to the alchemists themselves, it wasn't really about wealth. It was about the belief that all matter existed somewhere on a single ladder, moving slowly toward perfection, and that gold, untarnishable, warm, incorruptible, sat at the very top of that ladder. Lead, by contrast, was thought of as unripe. Not lesser, exactly, just unfinished. Something that hadn't yet had the time or the right conditions to mature into its final and most perfect self. So the alchemist's furnace wasn't only a place of chemistry. It was a place of patience, an attempt to compress into a human lifetime, a transformation that nature itself might take ages to complete on its own. You, too, are not required to be finished tonight. You are allowed to still be somewhere on the ladder, warming slowly, unhurried, cared for exactly as you are right now. But that is only one small part of the story. Long before there was air you could breathe, the Earth's first atmosphere was something closer to poison. It was mostly hydrogen and helium at first, thin and quickly lost to space. What followed was thicker. Clouds of methane, ammonia, carbon dioxide, water vapor, and sulfur compounds, vented endlessly from volcanoes that never seemed to rest. There was no oxygen to speak of. None of it would have been breathable for you, or for almost anything alive today. Picture a sky the color of rust and ash, thick and low, lit not by a clear sun, but by a dim orange smear behind endless haze. The ground rumbled constantly with volcanic activity. Rain, when it fell, may have fallen through a sky thick enough to taste like metal. And still, patiently, underneath that unbreathable sky, the ingredients for something else were quietly gathering. Water was pooling. Minerals were dissolving into it. Somewhere in that inhospitable soup, chemistry was slowly practicing the first rough drafts of biology. It is a strange kind of comfort, knowing that the very air that now fills your lungs so easily did not exist for a long, long time that it too had to be built, slowly, invisibly, before it became something as simple and vital as your next breath. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. One of alchemy's most famous ideas is something called the Philosopher's Stone. Not really a stone at all, but a substance, or perhaps a state, believed capable of turning base metals into gold, and perhaps even granting long life or healing. No one ever definitively found it. No one ever fully agreed on what it looked like, or how it worked, or even whether it was a physical object or something closer to a spiritual state achieved through the work itself. That uncertainty didn't stop centuries of searching. Alchemists across cultures and generations kept returning to their furnaces, their manuscripts, their careful notes, chasing something that may never have existed in the form they imagined. And yet, along the way, they discovered acids, alloys, dyes, and techniques that would eventually become the bones of real chemistry. Sometimes the destination you're chasing isn't quite real, and the real treasure turns out to be everything you learned by patiently, quietly searching for it anyway. Tonight, you don't need to find anything at all. You only need to rest. But that is only one small part of the story. Long, long before oxygen filled our skies, something almost impossibly small changed the entire planet. Tiny organisms called cyanobacteria, simple, single-celled, invisible to the naked eye, learned how to use sunlight to make their own food, releasing oxygen as a kind of leftover, a byproduct nobody had asked for. At first, the oceans and rocks simply absorbed this new oxygen, like a sponge soaking up water. Iron dissolved in the ancient seas rusted quietly, sinking down in thin, colorful bands that we can still find layered in rock today, like pages in a very old book. But eventually, around 2.5 billion years ago, the sponge could hold no more. Oxygen began to build up in the air itself, in an event scientists now call the Great Oxidation. For most of the life existing at that time, oxygen was not a gift. It was a toxin, and this slow flood of it caused one of the largest extinction events the planet has ever known. And yet, from that same shift, new kinds of life emerged, life built to use oxygen rather than fear it. Life like yours. You are, in a very real sense, descended from a planetary catastrophe that quietly became an opening. Something ended, and something else, patiently, learned to breathe inside the wreckage. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Alchemy loved its symbols, and few were as constant as the pairing of the sun and the moon. Gold was almost universally linked to the sun, bright, warm, untarnishing, associated with masculine energy and life-giving power in many traditions. Silver, cooler and more reflective, was linked to the moon, associated with the feminine, the receptive, the changing. In many alchemical illustrations, you'll find a golden sun king and a silver moon queen, sometimes shown separately, sometimes shown joined together in what texts often called a chemical wedding, a symbolic union representing the merging of opposites into something whole and balanced. It wasn't really about metals at all, in the end. It was about balance, heat, and coolness, giving and receiving, action and stillness, held together in one complete picture. Perhaps tonight, your own sun and moon can rest together for a while too. The parts of you that push, and the parts of you that simply need to be still, no longer pulling in opposite directions, just quietly, evenly balanced. But that is only one small part of the story. Mercury, the strange silver liquid metal, fascinated alchemists more than almost anything else in their workshops. It behaved like nothing else they knew. It was clearly a metal, heavy, shining, reflective. And yet it moved like water, pooling and splitting and reforming, never staying still, never freezing into a fixed shape at ordinary temperatures. To the alchemists, this in-between nature made Mercury feel almost magical, a substance that seemed to belong to two worlds at once. They believed it to be one of the essential building blocks of all metals, imagining that mercury combined with sulfur in different proportions to create everything from lead to silver to gold, deep within the earth. We now know mercury is dangerous, its vapors slowly poisoning many alchemists who worked closely with it for years, unaware of the quiet cost of their fascination. But at the time, it must have felt like holding a small, living piece of moonlight in your palm, bright, cool, shifting, alive. Not everything strange and beautiful is safe to hold too closely. Sometimes, the gentlest thing you can do for yourself is simply admire something from a careful distance. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. The oceans covering most of your planet right now were not always here. In the earliest chapters of Earth's story, water likely arrived from beyond the planet itself, carried inward by comets and water-rich asteroids from the outer edges of the solar system, colliding with the young, hot Earth again and again over millions of years. Some of that water may also have been trapped inside the rocky material that formed the planet in the first place, slowly released as the interior cooled and volcanic activity gradually eased. Either way, water that had drifted for ages through the cold dark between worlds eventually found its way to Earth's cooling surface, gathering in low places, filling basins, forming the first true oceans. Oceans with no fish, no coral, no waves breaking against any shore that a creature would ever see. Every drop of water you've ever tasted, every rainstorm, every quiet lake, traces its lineage back to that ancient, patient gathering, starlight and ice, slowly becoming sea. You, too, are mostly water, Some very old, very well-traveled part of you is resting in this room tonight, having come from somewhere impossibly far away and impossibly long ago. But that is only one small part of the story. While European alchemy chased gold and the philosopher's stone, a very different tradition of alchemy was unfolding in ancient China. One focused less on wealth and more on longevity. Taoist alchemists sought what they called elixirs of immortality, mixtures often involving minerals like mercury, sulfur, and various metallic compounds, believed to extend life indefinitely, or even grant a kind of physical transcendence. Some emperors, desperate to hold onto power and life a little longer, drank these elixirs regularly, trusting the promises of court alchemists. Tragically, several are now believed to have died from mercury and arsenic poisoning, the very substances meant to make them immortal, instead quietly shortening their lives. Alongside this external alchemy, a gentler tradition eventually grew internal alchemy, which shifted focus away from potions and toward practices like meditation, breath control, and internal cultivation, treating the human body itself as the vessel where transformation should happen, rather than a furnace. There's a quiet lesson resting inside that shift, that the search for something eternal sometimes moves, slowly and wisely, from something you swallow to something you simply breathe. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Islamic scholars during what's often called the Golden Age of learning didn't just preserve alchemical knowledge. They transformed it into something far closer to real chemistry. A scholar named Jabir ibn Hayyan, working in the 8th century, is often credited with developing more rigorous, methodical approaches to alchemical experimentation, careful observation, controlled processes, detailed recording of results, rather than purely symbolic or mystical reasoning. The very word alchemy carries this legacy inside it. It comes from the Arabic alchemia, which itself likely borrowed from that older Egyptian word for the dark, fertile land. Language, like metal in a furnace, kept being reshaped as it passed from hand to hand, culture to culture, century to century. From these workshops came real advances, refined techniques for distillation, methods for producing stronger acids, more precise ways of purifying substances. This wasn't only mysticism. This was patient, careful craft, laying stones that modern chemistry would later walk across. You don't need mysticism to be doing something meaningful right now, either. Simply resting, simply breathing slower, is its own quiet, careful craft. But that is only one small part of the story. One of alchemy's most lasting practical inventions is a simple device called the alembic, a distillation apparatus with a rounded body and a long, curved neck, designed to heat a liquid gently until it turned to vapor. Then guide that vapor into a separate vessel where it could cool and condense back into liquid form. This process let alchemists separate and concentrate substances in ways that simple boiling never could, purifying alcohol, extracting perfumes and essential oils, refining acids to greater strength. The shape of the alembic patient, curved, almost womb-like, mirrored the philosophy behind it. Nothing was destroyed in distillation. Something was simply drawn out gently and separated from what it no longer needed to carry. You could think of sleep itself as a kind of distillation. Nothing about your day is destroyed by resting. It's simply allowed to settle, to separate, so that only what truly matters condenses quietly into memory, and the rest is allowed to rise away like vapor and disappear. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Long before continents looked anything like the shapes on a map you might recognize, the Earth's landmasses gathered together and drifted apart, over and over, in impossibly slow rhythms. One of the earliest supercontinents scientists have identified is called Rodinia, thought to have formed around 1 billion years ago, drawing together nearly all the planet's land into a single connected mass. Rodinia did not last, of course. Nothing on this planet ever quite does. Over hundreds of millions of years, it slowly broke apart, its pieces drifting like continents do, eventually reforming into other configurations, other supercontinents, before breaking apart again and again, each time reshaping oceans, climates, and coastlines. We happen to live during one particular arrangement of that endless, unhurried dance, an arrangement that will itself eventually change beyond recognition, though far too slowly for any of us to notice in a single lifetime. There's something soothing in that scale. Whatever feels permanent and pressing to you tonight is, geologically speaking, softer than a whisper, already halfway toward becoming something else. But that is only one small part of the story. Modern chemistry owes far more to alchemy than most people realize, even in its most basic vocabulary. Words like alcohol, alkali, and elixir all trace back through alchemical Arabic and Latin texts. Laboratory equipment still in use today, flasks, retorts, crucibles, was refined and named largely by alchemists working centuries before anyone called what they did chemistry. Even the basic idea of careful, repeatable experimentation, of writing down what happened so someone else could try it again, took real shape inside alchemical workshops, long before it was formalized into the scientific method we recognize now. So when a modern chemist mixes reagents in a clean, well-labeled laboratory, they are, in a very real sense, still standing in a lineage that stretches back to smoky rooms lit by oil lamps, where someone was quietly convinced that lead could, with enough patience, become gold. Nothing you build carefully tonight, even something as simple as rest, happens in isolation. You're built from countless careful attempts that came before you, most of which you'll never know by name. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. The moon hanging quietly above you tonight has an origin story almost too dramatic to imagine from where you're lying now. The leading explanation among scientists is called the giant impact hypothesis. It suggests that early in Earth's history, a planet roughly the size of Mars, sometimes given the name Theia, collided with the young Earth in an immense, glancing blow. The impact would have been catastrophic, vaporizing rock, flinging molten debris into orbit around the wounded, reforming Earth. Slowly, over time, that debris gathered together, pulled by its own gravity, cooling and hardening into the moon you can sometimes see through your window, even now. In other words, the moon may be, quite literally, a piece of the Earth itself flung outward by violence, and then patiently, gradually, shaped into something calm, round, and steady. Something that would go on to gently pull the tides for billions of years. Even something born from collision can become, given enough time, one of the most soothing and constant presences in the sky. Whatever collided inside your own day can settle the same way into something steady, watching quietly over you as you rest. But that is only one small part of the story. Alchemical workshops were built almost entirely around fire, and fire, to the alchemist, was never simply heat. Furnaces were carefully constructed and maintained, sometimes burning for days or weeks without pause, requiring constant attention to temperature and airflow. Different stages of an alchemical process were believed to require different intensities of heat, gentle warming, moderate heat, or fierce, sustained fire, each associated with different transformations. Fire was seen as the active force that drove all change forward, the element that broke old forms apart so that new ones could be built from the pieces. Without fire, nothing in the alchemist's world could transform. Everything would simply remain as it always had been. There's something worth noticing in that belief, even now. Difficulty in small doses is sometimes the very thing that allows a change to happen at all. But no fire burns forever. Every furnace, eventually, is allowed to cool. Tonight, whatever fire your day required of you can finally, gently, begin to cool as well. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. One of the most famous alchemical texts is astonishingly short. Just a handful of lines, known as the Emerald Tablet, said to hold the secret of the one thing in compressed, riddling form. Its most famous line is often translated as something like "as above, so below," a phrase suggesting that the patterns found in the vast heavens are mirrored in the small and earthly, that the movement of stars and the movement of metal in a furnace might, in some deep way, follow the same underlying rhythm. No one is entirely certain who wrote it, or exactly when. Its true origin is wrapped in as much mystery as the transformations it describes. And yet it was copied, translated, and reinterpreted for well over 1,000 years, each generation finding new meaning inside its brief, cryptic lines. Perhaps there's comfort in that too, that something so short, so unfinished, so mysterious, could still hold enough weight to travel across 1,000 years of careful hands. You don't need long, complicated thoughts to carry you gently towards sleep tonight. Sometimes just a few soft, quiet lines are enough. But that is only one small part of the story. Long before the world, settled into its familiar blues and greens, it may have gone almost entirely white. Geological evidence suggests that on at least a couple of occasions, hundreds of millions of years ago, the Earth's surface became covered in ice from close to the poles all the way to the equator, an event scientists sometimes call Snowball Earth. Picture the planet as one long, unbroken sheet of frozen white, oceans locked beneath thick ice, land buried under endless snow, sunlight bouncing back off the surface almost entirely instead of warming it. Somehow, deep beneath that ice, volcanic activity continued quietly, releasing carbon dioxide that slowly built up in the atmosphere until, over millions of years, it was finally enough to warm the planet again, melting the ice, releasing the oceans, allowing life to continue the long story it had barely begun. Even total, silent, frozen stillness eventually gives way again to warmth, if you simply wait long enough and let quiet processes keep working beneath the surface, unseen. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Alchemists didn't only look downward into furnaces and crucibles. They looked upward too, weaving a close relationship between metals and the planets visible in the night sky. Gold was linked to the sun, silver to the moon, but the pattern continued. Iron was linked to Mars, copper to Venus, tin to Jupiter, lead to Saturn, and Mercury, fittingly, to the planet Mercury. This wasn't simple decoration. Many alchemists believed the planets actually influenced the slow formation of metals deep within the earth, their particular qualities somehow seeping downward through rock, shaping which metal would form in which vein, deep beneath the surface. Working with a particular metal, then, wasn't just chemistry. It was, in their eyes, a kind of quiet conversation with a specific corner of the heavens, brought down into the physical world through fire and patience. You, too, are made of elements that first came from stars. In a very real sense, you have always been in conversation with the sky, whether you've noticed it or not. But that is only one small part of the story. perhaps the most surprising alchemist in history isn't a name most people associate with mysticism at all. Isaac Newton, the scientist most remembered for gravity and motion. For decades, largely in private, Newton conducted extensive alchemical experiments, filling notebook after notebook with careful, coded observations about metals, transformations, and substances he believed might hold deeper secrets about the nature of matter itself. Much of this work stayed hidden for centuries after his death, considered an embarrassing footnote by many who preferred to remember him purely as a rational, modern thinker. Only much later did historians come to see it differently, not as a contradiction, but as part of the same restless curiosity that drove his more famous discoveries. Newton, it seems, didn't experience a hard line between mysticism and science the way we sometimes imagine one existed. He simply followed his curiosity wherever it led, in the daylight and in the shadows both. You don't need to resolve every contradiction in yourself tonight either. Curiosity is allowed to wander into more than one room at once. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Deep in certain rock formations around the world, you can find long, rust-colored stripes running through stone, alternating bands of red iron oxide and gray or green silica, layered like the pages of an ancient, patient book. These are called banded iron formations, and they're some of the clearest physical evidence we have of that early, slow rise of oxygen in Earth's oceans. As cyanobacteria quietly released oxygen, iron dissolved in the seawater, rusted and sank, settling in thin, seasonal-like layers on the ocean floor over and over for millions of years. Today, some of these ancient formations are mined for iron ore, meaning the steel in bridges, the frames of buildings, even small objects in your own home, may be made from rust laid down by microscopic life billions of years before anything with eyes existed to see it. There's something quietly moving in that. Even rust, something we usually think of as decay, can, given enough time, become the very material something new and strong is built from. But that is only one small part of the story. Many alchemical texts describe the great work, the pursuit of transformation, as unfolding through a series of color stages, almost like a private, symbolic rainbow. First came Negredo, the blackening, a stage of decay, breakdown, and darkness, where the original material was dissolved and reduced to something formless, almost like death. Then came Albedo, the whitening, a stage of purification, where what remained was washed and refined, growing lighter, cleaner, more clarified. Sometimes a stage called citrinitas followed, a subtle yellowing, a slow dawning of new understanding. And finally, rubedo, the reddening, the completion, the achievement of the philosopher's stone itself, symbolized by a deep, glowing red, the color of dawn, of blood, of gold finally fully ripened. darkness first, then clarity, then, only at the very end, the warm glow of completion. Perhaps your own nights follow something like that order too. First the letting go, then the quiet, then, eventually, morning. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Beneath the shifting oceans and drifting supercontinents, the Earth also holds far older, sturdier pieces, ancient cores of continental crust called cratons, some dating back more than 3 billion years. These cratons have survived nearly the entire history of plate tectonics, relatively intact, largely undisturbed by the mountain building and ocean opening that has reshaped so much of the rest of the planet's surface again and again. Scientists sometimes describe them as the keels of continents, deep, stable roots extending far down into the mantle, anchoring the more restless, changeable crust above them. In a world defined by constant slow movement, these ancient cores are, in their own patient way, the closest thing the Earth has to stillness, quietly enduring, while everything around them rearranges itself again and again. Perhaps you have something like that inside you too, some old, steady core formed long ago that has quietly outlasted every storm that's passed over it since. But that is only one small part of the story. Not every alchemist in history was chasing gold. A Swiss physician named Paracelsus, working in the 16th century, redirected much of alchemy's careful, experimental spirit toward medicine instead. He argued that the true purpose of alchemy wasn't to make gold, but to prepare remedies, carefully refining minerals and substances into treatments for illness, in ways far more deliberate than the folk medicine common at the time. He's also remembered for an idea that still echoes through toxicology today: the notion that the dose makes the poison, meaning that almost any substance, given in the right amount, could heal, and almost any substance, given in too great an amount, could harm. It was a quiet but powerful reframing. Not every alchemist's fire needed to be aimed at gold. Some fires, tended carefully enough, were meant to heal instead. Whatever you're carrying tonight, in the right small dose, rest itself is medicine too. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. If you wanted to hold the single oldest piece of solid earth ever found in your hand, you wouldn't need gold or diamond. You would need something far humbler, a tiny mineral crystal called zircon. Certain zircon crystals discovered in Western Australia have been dated to roughly 4.4 billion years old, meaning they formed only shortly after the Earth itself came together. During that fiery, chaotic Hadean period we wandered through earlier tonight, these crystals are almost impossibly small, often less than the width of a human hair, and yet they've survived essentially unchanged for nearly the entire life of the planet, drifting through billions of years of mountain building, erosion, and ocean, quietly holding their original structure intact the entire time. There's something deeply reassuring in that kind of endurance, that something this small, this quiet, could hold its shape through nearly the entire unimaginable span of Earth's history, simply by being patient and dense and unwilling to dissolve. But that is only one small part of the story. Alchemical imagery often leaned on the language of marriage and union to describe transformation, the coming together of opposites into something new and whole. Texts frequently described a symbolic king and queen, sun and moon, red and white, being joined in what was called the chemical wedding, their union believed necessary to produce the Philosopher's Stone. This wasn't only symbolic romance. It represented a deeper alchemical belief that true transformation required the balanced joining of seemingly opposite qualities, hot and cold, active and passive, solid and liquid. Illustrations from this period often show the king and queen standing together in a shared bath or vessel, sometimes depicted as merging into a single two-headed figure, representing the moment two separate natures become one integrated whole. Perhaps tonight, whatever opposites have been pulling at you, tiredness and restlessness, worry and hope, don't need to keep fighting each other. They're allowed, just for tonight, to quietly join hands instead. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Long before there were animals with shells or bones, some of the very first visible signs of life on Earth were quiet, layered structures called stromatolites. These weren't animals or plants in the way we usually think of them. They were built slowly over generations by mats of simple microorganisms trapping fine sediment and minerals, layer upon layer, forming rounded, dome-shaped mounds of rock. Some stromatolite fossils date back more than 3 billion years, making them among the oldest direct evidence of life on this planet, older than nearly everything else that would come after, older than fish, older than forests, older than anything with a face. In a handful of places on Earth today, living stromatolites still exist, quietly forming in shallow, salty water, continuing a rhythm that has barely changed in 3 billion years. There's a certain patience in that, a form of life that never rushed toward complexity, that simply kept layering itself, slowly, steadily, for longer than almost anything else has managed to survive. But that is only one small part of the story. Back among the Taoist alchemists of ancient China, one particularly haunting detail stands out. Several emperors are believed to have died slowly from the very elixirs meant to grant them eternal life. Court alchemists, under great pressure to deliver results, often relied on mercury and arsenic-based compounds, Sometimes, because these substances resist decay themselves and were mistakenly assumed to pass that same resistance on to whoever consumed them. Historical records suggest that at least a handful of emperors across different dynasties suffered chronic poisoning, mental instability, or early death directly linked to their long-term consumption of these so-called immortality elixirs. It's a quiet, sobering thread inside an otherwise fascinating story. The desire to escape time entirely, sometimes leading, tragically, closer to it instead. Tonight, you don't need to escape time. You only need to rest gently inside it, letting it pass over you the way it's meant to, without resistance. There's something else worth resting on for a moment. Many alchemical manuscripts were written in a form of coded language, sometimes called decknamen or cover names, where common substances were disguised under poetic, misleading, or symbolic labels. Green lion, for instance, might refer to a particular acid. Dragon's blood might mean a certain red resin or pigment. The true meaning was often known only to a small circle of practitioners, passed along through mentorship rather than written explanation. This secrecy wasn't purely paranoid. In many cases, alchemists genuinely believed dangerous knowledge needed to be protected from careless or unprepared hands, or that the search itself was meant to be a personal, hard-won journey rather than a shortcut handed freely to anyone. There's something almost comforting in imagining these old texts, now full of green lions and dragon's blood, hiding humble chemistry beneath poetry, patiently waiting for someone willing to learn the language slowly enough to understand. But that is only one small part of the story. While metal was cooling in furnaces above, something else far below was quietly organizing itself into one of the planet's most important hidden systems. Deep within the Earth, a liquid outer core of iron and nickel churns slowly, driven by heat rising from the even hotter solid inner core. This slow churning motion generates electrical currents, and those currents, in turn, generate Earth's magnetic field, an invisible shield extending far out into space. This field does something quietly essential. It deflects much of the sun's harsher radiation and particle storms away from the surface, protecting the atmosphere and everything living beneath it from being gradually stripped away the way it likely was on Mars. You've never seen this field. You'll probably never feel it directly. And yet, it has been faithfully, invisibly shielding you and everything you love for your entire life, without ever once asking to be noticed. Some of the most important things protecting you tonight are like that too, quiet, constant, and completely unseen. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Sulfur held a particularly strange, almost feared reputation among alchemists, pale yellow, sharp-smelling, prone to burning with an eerie blue flame. Alongside mercury, sulfur was considered one of the essential principles believed to combine and form all metals deep within the earth. Where mercury represented fluidity, spirit, and the volatile, sulfur represented combustibility, the soul's fire, the active principle that gave a substance its capacity to burn and transform. Its association with fire and brimstone gave it a slightly ominous reputation in wider culture too, linked in some traditions with the underworld, with sudden violent change, with the smell that lingered after lightning struck too close. And yet, in the alchemists' careful hands, sulfur wasn't feared so much as respected, a necessary, active ingredient, dangerous only when handled without patience or care. Even the sharpest, most unsettling parts of a difficult day can, treated with enough patience, become simply one ingredient among many, rather than something to fear. But that is only one small part of the story. Around 3.9 billion years ago, something violent was still happening across the young solar system. An intense pulse of asteroid and comet impacts, known as the Late Heavy Bombardment. During this period, the Moon, Mercury, and likely Earth itself were struck repeatedly by large objects, leaving behind many of the vast, ancient craters still visible on the Moon's surface today. Preserved because the Moon has no wind, water, or plate tectonics to slowly erase them, the way Earth eventually did to its own scars. Earth's craters from this period have mostly vanished, worn away by billions of years of erosion, ocean, and shifting continents. But the Moon still quietly holds the record, a fossilized memory of a chaotic time neither world can otherwise easily recall. Isn't it strange, in a tender way, that the Moon carries scars on your behalf, remembering, so gently and so silently, a violence the Earth itself was able to heal from and forget? There is something else worth resting on for a moment. By the late 18th century, a French scientist named Anton Lavoisier helped guide the old, symbolic language of alchemy into the more precise, measurable language of modern chemistry. Lavoisier insisted on careful, exact measurement, weighing substances meticulously before and after reactions, tracking exactly where mass went rather than assuming it simply vanished or transformed unpredictably. This careful attention helped establish the law of conservation of mass, the idea that matter is neither created nor destroyed, only rearranged. In many ways, this was the final, quiet culmination of everything alchemy had been reaching toward for centuries. Not mystical transformation, but precise, patient, careful transformation, understood at last with clear eyes rather than symbolic ones. The dream of turning lead into gold never quite came true, the way the old alchemists imagined. But the dream of understanding matter deeply and precisely absolutely did build slowly on the careful foundations they laid without ever fully realizing where it would lead. Nothing careful you do is ever wasted, even if the final shape it takes looks nothing like what you originally imagined. But that is only one small part of the story. Billions of years ago, your days would have felt strangely rushed, even before you'd done anything at all. Early in Earth's history, the planet spun much faster than it does now, meaning each full day and night cycle lasted only a handful of hours rather than 24. Over billions of years, the gravitational pull of the moon has been slowly, patiently stealing a little of Earth's rotational energy, gradually lengthening each day, fraction of a second by fraction of a second, century after century. The moon itself has been slowly drifting farther away during all this time too, moving outward by only a few centimeters each year. An almost imperceptible retreat, invisible within a single human lifetime, and yet vast enough to measure across the sweep of deep time. Somewhere in that slow lengthening of days lies a quiet reminder. Even the length of a day itself was never fixed. It was earned slowly, patiently, gently stretched into something long enough to hold an evening like this one. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Not every act of alchemy stayed confined to secretive laboratories, chasing gold from lead. Many alchemists also practiced very real, very practical crafts, including gilding, the art of applying thin layers of real gold onto other materials, techniques for beating gold into astonishingly thin sheets, then carefully applying it to wood, plaster, or metal using specially prepared adhesives, were refined over centuries. Some methods still used by artisans today, almost unchanged. This wasn't transmutation in the mystical sense the old texts dreamed of, but in a very real, tactile way. It did allow something ordinary, a plain wooden frame, a simple statue, to be transformed, at least on its surface, into something that gleamed like gold, catching candlelight the same way true gold would. Sometimes transformation doesn't need to reach all the way to the core of something to still feel real and meaningful. A little warmth, carefully applied, can be enough to change how something shines. But that is only one small part of the story. Beneath the triaprima, mercury, sulfur, and salt, alchemists eventually placed salt as a third essential principle, representing the physical body itself, the solid, stable form that gave a substance its shape and permanence. Where mercury represented spirit and sulfur represented soul, salt represented body, the quiet, grounding element that allowed the other two, more volatile principles, to have any lasting presence in the physical world at all. Without salt, in this framework, spirit and soul would simply drift apart, formless, with nothing solid to hold them together. Salt was, in a sense, the alchemical idea of home, the necessary container that let everything else settle and remain. Your own body is doing something like that for you right now, quietly, patiently holding together everything else that makes you who you are, even while your thoughts and feelings drift and shift above it. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Long after the first simple cells appeared, a new and more complex kind of life quietly emerged, cells with a distinct nucleus, called eukaryotes, ancestors of nearly all complex life that would eventually follow, including every plant, animal, and human being. Scientists believe this leap may have happened through an extraordinary act of ancient cooperation. One simple cell absorbing another, rather than digesting it. The two eventually settling into a stable, mutually beneficial partnership that persisted for the rest of both their lineages. Those absorbed cells are still with us today, living quietly inside nearly every cell in your body as mitochondria, tiny structures that generate the energy your body needs to do absolutely everything, from thinking to breathing to simply being warm. You are not one single thing, and never entirely have been. You are, and always have been, a quiet, ancient partnership. Two very different kinds of life that once decided, billions of years ago, to stop competing and simply share a home instead. But that is only one small part of the story. Alchemy also carried an idea, sometimes called the prima materia, or first matter, the belief that beneath every metal's outward differences, there existed a shared, formless raw material from which all of them ultimately arose. Gold, lead, iron, silver, despite looking and behaving so differently, were thought to be, at their deepest root, expressions of this same underlying substance, simply shaped differently by different combinations and conditions. This idea echoes, in its own quiet way, something modern physics eventually confirmed from an entirely different direction: that every element, from the lightest hydrogen to the heaviest metals, is ultimately built from the same handful of fundamental particles, arranged differently. Difference, in other words, doesn't always mean separateness. Sometimes it simply means the same raw material, patiently, endlessly rearranging itself into new and unexpected shapes. You and the person you were years ago, and the person you might become, all made, in some sense, from the very same first matter, simply rearranged. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Certain alchemical laboratories, particularly those attached to royal courts, became strange, layered places, part workshop, part treasury, part philosophical retreat, where powerful patrons funded elaborate experiments in hopes of solving their kingdom's financial troubles with a single, gleaming breakthrough. Some rulers genuinely believed a successful alchemist could refill an empty treasury overnight. Others quietly suspected the whole endeavor was mostly theater, but funded it anyway, drawn in by the philosophical prestige, or simply the entertainment of watching such dedicated, mysterious work unfold. Many alchemists walked a careful line in these environments, needing to appear confident and promising enough to maintain funding and protection, while privately, honestly, still deep in genuine uncertainty about whether their work would ever succeed. There's something very human in that tension, outwardly steady, inwardly still searching, still uncertain, still hoping quietly that the next attempt might finally be the one that settles everything. You don't need certainty tonight either. You're allowed to simply keep going, patiently, one gentle breath at a time. But that is only one small part of the story. Beneath the ocean floor, in places where Earth's crust is thinnest, mineral-rich water sometimes escapes through openings called hydrothermal vents, heated by magma far below. These vents create strange, dark oases on the ocean floor, warm and rich with dissolved minerals in a place otherwise cold, dark, and largely empty. Some scientists believe environments like these, deep in the earliest oceans, may have provided exactly the right conditions for the very first chemical steps toward life: warmth, minerals, and shelter from the harsher, more chaotic surface above. In a way, these vents are quiet, ancient furnaces of their own, not built by human hands, but by the planet itself, patiently combining heat and mineral and water in the dark, long before anyone was there to call the process alchemy. Perhaps the very first alchemist wasn't a person at all. Perhaps it was simply the ocean floor, patiently experimenting in the dark, long before there was anyone around to notice, or name, or wonder at what it was quietly creating. There's something else worth resting on for a moment. Gold itself was never actually made on Earth. It arrived here already finished. Every atom of gold you've ever seen in a ring, a coin, a thread of embroidery was forged long before this planet existed, deep inside the extreme violence of colliding neutron stars, collapsing stellar remnants so dense that a single teaspoon of their material would weigh more than a mountain. Those collisions, scattered across the galaxy over billions of years, flung heavy elements like gold outward into space as fine dust, which eventually drifted, mixed, and settled into the same cloud that would later become our sun and planets. Alchemists spent centuries trying to create gold from lesser metals in their furnaces, never realizing that gold was, in truth, older than fire itself, older than the sun, older than the earth, already perfect and finished long before any human hand tried tried to summon it into being. There's a quiet humility in that. Some of the most treasured things in your life may already be complete, exactly as they are, without needing your effort to finish them. Sometimes the work isn't creation. Sometimes it's simply noticing what already arrived long ago, fully formed. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. When knowledge of alchemy began moving from the Islamic world into medieval Europe, it didn't arrive all at once. It arrived slowly, patiently, through translation. In cities like Toledo, in Spain, scholars gathered old Arabic texts, themselves often built on even older Greek and Egyptian foundations, and carefully rendered them into Latin, the shared scholarly language of medieval Europe. This work was slow and painstaking, requiring translators fluent in multiple languages, willing to sit for years with dense, symbolic material, trying to carry its full meaning across the gap between cultures. Without this quiet, unglamorous labor, much of alchemy's accumulated knowledge might never have reached the workshops and universities of Europe at all. The gold seekers who came later, the philosophers, the early chemists, all of them were standing, without quite realizing it, on the patient work of translators who never touched a furnace themselves. Some of the most important transformations happen not in fire, but in quiet rooms over many slow years, one careful word passed gently into another. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Long before continents looked like anything familiar, the very first landmasses to rise above the ancient oceans were built from a strange, fiery kind of rock that no longer exists in its original form anywhere on Earth today. These early lava flows, called cometates, erupted at temperatures far higher than any lava seen in modern volcanoes. So hot that the molten rock flowed almost like water rather than the thick, slow lava we picture today. The Earth's interior, still radiating heat left over from its violent formation, simply had more fire available to give. As the planet has slowly cooled over billions of years, this kind of ultra-hot eruption has become impossible. The Earth, in a sense, has been gently lowering its own flame for its entire existence, generation of rock by generation of rock, quietly and irreversibly settling into something calmer than it once was. If a planet can spend billions of years learning to lower its own fire, so can you, for just one evening. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Deep within the alchemical worldview sat a peculiar, evocative idea called the azoth, sometimes described as a universal solvent, a substance believed capable of dissolving anything, breaking any material down to its most basic, formless state, so that something new could be built from it. Some alchemists considered the azoth not a specific chemical at all, but closer to a principle, a kind of active spirit believed to exist quietly within all matter, waiting to be drawn out and concentrated through careful work. Others searched for it, as literally as they searched for the philosopher's stone itself, convinced it might be found in mercury, or in a rare mineral, or in some combination not yet discovered. No universal solvent was ever truly found, of course, but the searching itself reveals something tender about the alchemist's hope, the belief that no material, however hardened or fixed it seemed, was ever truly beyond the reach of gentle, patient dissolving. Whatever feels fixed and unmovable in your mind tonight is not as permanent as it feels. Even the hardest things can soften, given enough patient, quiet time. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Some alchemical manuscripts hid their instructions inside a single word, built letter by letter from a longer Latin phrase, a technique almost like a secret held inside a name. The word was vitriol, and it stood for a phrase that translates roughly to visit the interior of the earth, and by rectifying, you shall find the hidden stone. Each letter of vitriol marked the first letter of a word in that longer sentence, compressing an entire philosophy of inward searching into a single, ordinary-sounding term for a common corrosive substance. The message tucked inside it was gentle, even if the process it described was harsh, that the answers being sought were not out in the wider world at all, but somewhere down, inward, hidden quietly beneath the surface, waiting only to be visited with patience and honesty. You don't need to travel anywhere tonight to find what you're looking for. It's already resting quietly inside you, waiting simply to be visited, gently, without force. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Continents float, in a very real sense, the way a raft floats on water, not because they're anchored to anything below, but because the rock they're made from is simply lighter than the rock beneath it. Continental crust, rich in lighter minerals like granite, sits higher and thicker than the denser, heavier basalt that makes up the ocean floor. This difference in density is why continents rise above sea level while ocean basins remain low, filled instead with water. A difference set in place by chemistry alone, long before anyone stood on solid ground to notice it. Beneath the ground you may be resting on tonight, this quiet arrangement of density and buoyancy has been holding steady for billions of years. An entire landmass gently floating, unnoticed, the whole time you've lived your life upon it. You too are held up right now by something steady and quiet beneath you, doing its patient work without ever asking to be thanked. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. An old alchemical symbol appearing across many unrelated cultures throughout history shows a serpent or dragon curled into a circle, its mouth closed gently around its own tail. This image, sometimes called the Ouroboros, was used by alchemists to represent the cyclical nature of transformation. The idea that endings and beginnings were never truly separate, that destruction and creation moved in one continuous, unbroken loop, rather than a straight line from start to finish. Metal melted down was not lost, only returned to a formless state from which something new could rise. Matter decayed only to become the raw material of something else entirely. Nothing in this view was ever wasted, only folded back into the circle, waiting patiently for its next shape. Whatever feels like an ending in your life tonight may, in its own quiet way, simply be curling back around toward some new beginning you can't yet see. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. For most of Earth's long history, there was no life on land at all, only in water, sheltered from a sky that would have been lethal to anything trying to breathe there directly. For nearly 3 billion years, the atmosphere lacked a protective ozone layer, meaning ultraviolet radiation from the sun struck the surface with far greater intensity than it does today. Intensity strong enough to damage the delicate chemistry of living cells. Only in the oceans, shallows, and depths was life shielded enough to survive and slowly diversify. It was that same slow buildup of oxygen from ancient microbial life, drifting high into the atmosphere, that eventually formed a thin, protective layer of ozone, finally allowing life, hundreds of millions of years later, to cautiously begin its first tentative movements onto dry land. Somewhere deep in your own ancestry is a small, patient organism that waited in shallow water for longer than you can imagine, simply because the sky above it wasn't safe yet, and it was willing to wait until it was. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Not every alchemical discovery was mystical or symbolic. Some were simply strange, accidental, and completely real. In the 17th century, a German alchemist named Hennig Brand, searching obsessively for the Philosopher's Stone, began experimenting with an unusual raw material. Large quantities of human urine, which he boiled, distilled, and processed for months, convinced its golden color held some hidden secret to transmutation. He never found gold. Instead, quite by accident, he discovered an entirely new element, phosphorus, a waxy substance that glowed faintly in the dark and burst into flame on contact with air. It was the first new element discovered since ancient times, found not through careful theory, but through stubborn, patient, slightly absurd persistence. Sometimes the thing you find isn't the thing you were searching for at all, and it turns out to be remarkable anyway, simply because you were patient and curious enough to keep looking. There's something else worth resting on for a moment. Far beneath your feet, deeper than any ocean, deeper than any drilled well has ever reached. The earth quietly manufactures one of its most prized and delicate treasures. Diamonds form under conditions of extraordinary heat and pressure, roughly 100 miles or more below the surface, where carbon atoms are squeezed into their hardest, most tightly bonded arrangement. They remain down there patiently for hundreds of millions or even billions of years, until rare, violent volcanic eruptions called kimberlite pipes occasionally carry them rapidly upward, preserving their structure just long enough to reach the surface before the pressure that made them possible disappears. Every diamond that has ever been found was once utterly hidden, formed in crushing darkness, for far longer than any human civilization has existed, waiting for a chance eruption to carry it somewhere it could finally be seen. Whatever quiet strength has been forming in you, under pressure, in the dark, doesn't need to be seen right away to already be real. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Alchemists placed enormous significance on the number 7, largely because of a simple, ancient observation. 7 metals were known to the ancient world, and 7 wandering lights moved visibly across the night sky. Gold, silver, copper, iron, tin, lead, and mercury. Each corresponded to one of the 7 classical planets: the Sun, the Moon, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and Mercury. Visible to the naked eye long before telescopes existed to reveal anything further out in the darkness beyond them. This tidy correspondence gave alchemists a sense of cosmic order, a feeling that the small, earthly world of metal and furnace was quietly mirrored by the vast, unreachable world moving slowly overhead. 7 metals below, 7 lights above, both following patterns too large and too old to fully explain. There is a kind of order like that resting above you right now too, whether you can name every part of it or not. Steady, patterned, quietly continuing on regardless of whether you're awake to watch it. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. In ancient Egypt, long before alchemy had a name, the practical work of preserving the dead was already, in its own way, a careful chemical art. Embalmers used a naturally occurring mineral salt called natron, gathered from dry lake beds, to draw moisture out of the body over the course of many weeks, halting the natural process of decay through slow, deliberate dehydration, rather than any single dramatic act. The process required patience, precision, and a deep respect for the material being transformed. This careful, ritualized handling of the body, removing what needed to be removed, preserving what needed to be kept, working slowly rather than rushing toward a finished result, carried, in its quiet method, if not its purpose, the very same spirit that would later animate alchemical workshops across the ancient world. You don't need to rush towards stillness tonight either. Like that ancient, careful process, you're allowed to let go slowly, one small layer at a time. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Alchemists frequently spoke of a necessary stage they called putrefaction, a deliberate, controlled decay, where a substance was allowed to break down, darken, and seemingly spoil before any new transformation could begin. This wasn't considered a failure or a wrong turn. It was considered essential, unavoidable, the very first true step of the entire process. Without decay, without the old form fully dissolving, nothing new could ever properly take its place. The alchemist's task at this stage was not to prevent the darkening, but to trust it and wait. There's something quietly reassuring in a tradition that made room for decay as a necessary, even sacred, part of transformation, that didn't treat falling apart as the opposite of progress, but as one of its earliest, most necessary stages. Whatever in you feels like it's quietly breaking down tonight may simply be doing the necessary, unglamorous first work of becoming something new. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Nearly 9/10 of Earth's entire history, roughly 4 billion years out of 4.5, belongs to a vast stretch of time known simply as the Precambrian, a span so enormous that all the more familiar chapters of Earth's story, the dinosaurs, the ice ages, the rise of mammals, are squeezed into just the final 10th. For nearly all of that immense stretch, life remained microscopic, hidden, slow-moving, and largely invisible without a microscope. Patiently developing the basic biological tools like oxygen production and complex cells that every later form of life would eventually depend on. It can be strange to realize that almost the entire story of this planet happened quietly, without anything resembling a plant, an animal, or a single visible creature moving across its surface. Just patient, microscopic work, continuing steadily for billions of years before anything larger ever arrived to take notice. Most of the important work in any long story happens quietly, underneath, long before anything visible appears to show for it. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. In quiet corners of the natural world, actual geological distillation has been happening for as long as the earth has had water, heat, and stone arranged in just the right way. In geothermal regions, water seeping deep underground is heated by magma or hot rock, then rises back toward the surface carrying dissolved minerals, sometimes emerging as clear hot springs, sometimes as pressurized geysers, sometimes simply as warm, mineral-rich pools nestled quietly among cooler stone. In a very real sense, these are nature's own alembics, patient, underground apparatuses, distilling and concentrating minerals over centuries, with no alchemist required at all. No furnace built by human hands, just heat, water, and stone, doing slowly and quietly what a laboratory tries to do quickly. The earth has been practicing its own kind of alchemy this whole time, with or without anyone watching, simply because heat and water and stone, given enough patience, will always find some way to transform one another. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. One of the last, small ones tonight. A philosopher and scientist named Robert Boyle, writing in the 17th century, helped ease the old world of alchemy gently into the newer world of chemistry, without ever fully abandoning the wonder that had always driven it. In a work often remembered for its skeptical, questioning title, Boyle challenged some of the older, looser theories about the fundamental nature of matter, calling instead for more careful, evidence-based reasoning. And yet Boyle himself continued to take alchemical ideas seriously throughout much of his life, still hoping quietly that transmutation might one day prove possible. He stood, in other words, exactly at the hinge point between two worlds, unwilling to accept old ideas without question, but equally unwilling to let go of wonder simply because it hadn't yet been proven. Somewhere between skepticism and hope, he simply kept working, patiently, letting each new answer lead him gently to the next question. You're allowed to rest somewhere between certainty and wonder tonight too, not needing every answer, only willing to stay curious, gently, until sleep finally arrives. Long before anyone learned to smelt iron from rock, a few very fortunate ancient peoples were already working with it, thanks to gifts that fell from the sky. Meteoric iron, fragments of ancient asteroids that survived the fiery descent through Earth's atmosphere, was sometimes found lying on the ground, already metallic, already usable, requiring no furnace or smelting process at all to shape into a blade or an ornament. Some of the very earliest iron objects ever crafted by human hands, including a dagger found resting beside an ancient pharaoh, were later found to be made from this fallen, extraterrestrial metal. To the people who found and shaped it, this iron must have seemed impossibly rare and precious, arriving from nowhere ordinary, carrying with it a kind of unearned magic, simply because of where it had traveled from before it landed at their feet. Some gifts arrive in your life the same way, unearned, unexpected, having traveled a long, unseen distance before quietly landing exactly where you needed them. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. within the newly forming Earth, in an event sometimes called the Iron Catastrophe. Something enormous and largely invisible was quietly reshaping the entire planet from the inside. As the young Earth's interior heated from the constant impact of collisions and the decay of radioactive elements, dense iron began to melt and sink slowly toward the center, while lighter rocky material rose gradually toward the surface. Over time, this process separated the planet into the layered structure it still holds today. A dense metallic core at the center, a thick rocky mantle above it, and a thin, light crust floating on top of everything else. This sorting likely happened relatively quickly. In geological terms, perhaps within the first few tens of millions of years of the planet's life. One of the most significant reorganizations the Earth would ever undergo, and one that made the magnetic field, and eventually life itself, possible. Sometimes, the most important reorganizing happens quietly, deep beneath the surface, sorting the heavy from the light, so that everything above can finally settle into a shape that holds. There's something else worth resting on for a moment. Long before bronze or iron, one of humanity's earliest true metallurgical achievements came from combining too much softer metals into something far stronger than either alone. Ancient smiths discovered that mixing copper with a small amount of tin produced bronze, a harder, more durable alloy capable of holding a sharper edge and withstanding far more wear than either parent metal could manage on its own. This discovery was significant enough to give an entire era of human history its name, and the search for reliable sources of tin, often scarce and difficult to trade for, shaped ancient economies and trade routes across vast distances. There's something quietly poetic in the fact that strength, in this case, wasn't found in a single, pure substance, but in the careful combination of two softer, more ordinary ones, brought together in just the right proportion. You don't need to be made of one single, unbroken substance to be strong. Sometimes strength comes from exactly how your softer parts are combined. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. While European alchemists searched patiently for gold, a group of Chinese alchemists, searching for something else, entirely stumbled upon one of the most consequential mixtures in human history. In their continued pursuit of elixirs for immortality, alchemists experimenting with saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal discovered, likely quite unexpectedly, a mixture that didn't grant eternal life at all, but instead burned with startling, unpredictable ferocity. Early written warnings from the period caution against combining these ingredients carelessly, describing burns and fires resulting from exactly the kind of experimentation that would, centuries later, be refined into gunpowder. The irony is a gentle, almost wry one, a substance discovered while chasing eternal life, instead became deeply entangled in the centuries that followed, with warfare and mortality. Not every discovery arrives wearing the meaning we expected it to carry. Whatever you find tonight, while your mind wanders, doesn't need to match what you were originally looking for. It's allowed to simply be its own quiet, unexpected thing. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Hundreds of millions of years ago, in a period now called the Carboniferous, much of the Earth's land was covered in vast, humid swamps, filled with towering ferns and primitive trees, unlike anything alive today. As these ancient plants died, they didn't fully decompose the way plant matter usually does, largely because the fungi and microbes capable of breaking down a tough plant compound called lignin hadn't yet evolved. Instead, dead plant material piled up in thick, unbroken layers, gradually buried under sediment, compressed over millions of years by heat and pressure into the dense, dark seams of coal still mined from the ground today. In a very real sense, entire ancient forests are still resting quietly underground right now, patiently holding onto sunlight they gathered hundreds of millions of years before your grandparents were even born. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. In the ancient cities of Mesopotamia, long before formal alchemy existed as a named discipline, careful artisans were already practicing a quiet, patient chemistry of their own. Early glassmakers learned to heat sand, along with certain mineral additives, to extreme temperatures until it flowed like thick honey, then cooled it slowly and carefully into clear or colored glass, shaping vessels, beads, and decorative inlays through a process requiring exact timing and careful control of heat. Skills not far removed from those the alchemists would later refine in their own furnaces. These early glassmakers left behind detailed clay tablets recording their formulas and techniques. Some of the oldest known written instructions for any chemical process, carefully preserved not through mysticism, but through simple, practical record-keeping meant to be passed on. Even the most ordinary careful craft, tended patiently over generations, can quietly become the foundation something much larger is eventually built upon. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Ancient peoples, long before understanding volcanic geology, sometimes found strange, glassy black stones scattered near certain mountains, sharp enough to cut skin with the faintest touch. Obsidian forms when lava cools so rapidly that its minerals have no time to arrange themselves into crystals at all, leaving behind a smooth, glass-like volcanic rock instead of ordinary stone. Ancient toolmakers prized it enormously, capable of shaping it into blades and points sharper, in some cases, than even modern surgical steel. It's a striking thought that some of the sharpest, most precise tools ever made by early human hands came not from careful metalworking at all, but from stone that simply cooled too quickly to become anything else. Sometimes the sharpest clarity comes not from long, careful shaping, but simply from something cooling quickly enough to freeze a single, clean moment in place. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Not every alchemical treasure came from a furnace. Some arrived already finished, carried gently out of ancient forests by resin that never quite finished hardening. Amber begins as sticky tree sap, oozing slowly from wounded bark millions of years ago. Occasionally, small insects, seeds, or even tiny feathers became trapped within it before it fully hardened, preserved in remarkable, almost impossible detail as the resin slowly transformed over millions of years into a smooth, golden gemstone. Ancient peoples, encountering amber long before understanding its true origin, often regarded it as something magical. Sunlight, somehow, made solid, carrying tiny frozen worlds inside it that had no business surviving so completely intact after so much time had passed. Some part of who you were years ago is preserved like that too, quietly held somewhere inside you, unchanged, waiting patiently, long after the moment it happened has otherwise passed. There is something else worth resting on for a moment, deep beneath ancient dried seabeds, in places where oceans once existed, and then slowly, patiently evaporated away entirely. The earth left behind enormous, gleaming layers of salt. As shallow ancient seas evaporated under intense sun, dissolved minerals left behind became concentrated, layer upon layer, forming vast underground deposits of salt, sometimes thousands of feet thick, some so extensive they're mined today for both food and industry. In certain places, these ancient salt layers form dramatic surface flats, blindingly white, stretching for miles in flat, cracked patterns like the skin of something very old and very calm. There's a certain stillness in imagining an entire ancient ocean quietly, slowly disappearing, leaving behind nothing but this fine, pale residue proof that something vast once existed here, even though nothing about it looks like an ocean any longer. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Alchemists rarely worked whenever they simply felt like it. Many believed the success of their work depended heavily on timing, particularly the alignment of the heavens above their workshop. Certain operations were believed to require specific planetary hours, particular days of the week, associated with a given planet's ruling metal, or specific phases of the moon thought to influence how receptive matter would be to transformation. An alchemist might delay an important step for days or weeks, simply waiting for the sky to align correctly before continuing their work. This patient, deliberate waiting wasn't seen as wasted time. It was considered an essential part of the process itself, a recognition that transformation couldn't simply be forced whenever convenient, but needed the right conditions, the right timing, arriving in its own unhurried way. You don't need to force sleep to arrive on any particular schedule tonight either. It, too, is simply waiting for the right quiet alignment, and it will come when it comes. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. In certain volcanic regions, water rich in dissolved silica slowly seeps through cracks in porous rock, and over long stretches of time, something quietly beautiful can form from nothing more than that patient mineral deposit. Opal forms as this silica-rich water gradually evaporates, leaving behind tiny, tightly packed spheres of silica that, depending on their exact size and arrangement, bend light in ways that produce the gem's characteristic shifting flashes of color. No two opals form under identical conditions, meaning every single one carries a slightly different, unrepeatable pattern of color trapped inside it. Ancient peoples who encountered opal often believed it held captured fragments of lightning or fallen starlight, cooled and trapped inside ordinary stone. An understandable guess for something that seems to hold so much shifting light inside such quiet, solid material. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. The vast library once housed in ancient Alexandria, home to countless scrolls on medicine, astronomy, and the early practical arts that would later feed directly into alchemical tradition, was gradually lost over centuries, not in one single dramatic event, as popular legend often suggests, but through a slow accumulation of neglect, conflict, and quiet decline. Many texts on early metallurgy, dyeing, and chemical practice, written by the same Alexandrian craftspeople who helped give alchemy its first formal shape, were likely lost this way, not burned in a single night, but simply uncopied, unread, and eventually forgotten, as fewer hands remained to carry them forward. It's a gentle, somewhat sobering reminder that knowledge doesn't usually vanish all at once. It fades slowly, quietly, unless someone, somewhere, keeps choosing to pass it carefully along. Whatever you choose to remember from tonight, and whatever you simply let go of, both are perfectly all right. Nothing here needed to be carried forward at all. Long, long ago, if you had stood on Earth and looked upward, the moon hanging above you would have looked far larger than the one you know tonight. In the aftermath of its violent formation, the moon orbited much closer to Earth than it does now, meaning it appeared dramatically larger in the sky, and its gravitational pull created tides far more extreme than any ocean experiences today. Walls of water rising and retreating with a force that would seem almost unimaginable now. Over billions of years, as the moon has slowly drifted outward, those tides have gentled considerably, softening gradually into the calmer, more rhythmic rise and fall we associate with beaches and shorelines today. The moon didn't stop influencing the tides. It simply learned, slowly, patiently, to hold them more gently. Whatever pulled strongly at you earlier in your life doesn't have to keep pulling with that same force forever. Even the moon has learned to hold things more softly with time. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Not everything ancient buried underground stays rock forever. Sometimes, given exactly the right conditions, wood itself can slowly become stone. When a fallen tree becomes buried quickly enough, cut off from the oxygen that would normally cause it to rot, mineral-rich water can seep gradually into its structure, depositing silica or other minerals cell by cell. So slowly and precisely that the tree's original grain, rings, and texture remain perfectly visible, even after every trace of the original organic material has been replaced by solid stone. The result, called petrified wood, can look astonishingly like an ordinary log at first glance, until you notice its unexpected weight, or the way light catches faint mineral color inside what should have been plain brown bark. Something in you can hold its original shape too, even while everything softer inside it slowly changes into something new and far more lasting. There's something else worth resting on for a moment. Alchemists working with pigments were, in their own quiet way, chasing color the same way others chased gold. And one particular blue was worth nearly as much. Ultramarine, one of the most prized pigments in history, was made by grinding a rare, deep blue stone called lapis lazuli, sourced almost entirely from a single remote mountain region, into an extremely fine powder through a long, careful, labor-intensive process. For centuries, this exact, brilliant blue was so costly that it was reserved for only the most important paintings, sometimes valued more highly than gold itself, ounce for ounce. Alchemists and early pigment makers guarded their exact grinding and purification methods closely, understanding that the beauty of the final color depended entirely on the patience of the process used to release it from the raw, unremarkable stone. Something beautiful in you, too, may simply be waiting on the right patient process to gently release it from whatever plain, ordinary shape it's currently resting inside. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Sometimes, deep within ordinary-looking rock, nature quietly hollows out a small, secret chamber and slowly, patiently fills it with crystal. Geodes begin as gas bubbles trapped inside cooling volcanic rock, or as gaps left behind by dissolved material within sedimentary stone. Over long stretches of time, mineral-rich water seeps into these hollow spaces, depositing thin layers of crystal along the inner walls, one microscopic layer at a time, until the once empty cavity is lined with quartz, amethyst, or other crystal formations, invisible from the outside, until the rock is finally broken open. An ordinary, unremarkable stone might carry something like this quietly inside it for millions of years, with absolutely nothing on its plain gray surface hinting at the quiet brilliance patiently gathering within. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Ancient miners on the island of Cyprus, extracting a reddish, gleaming metal from the earth for thousands of years, gave that metal a name that has quietly followed it ever since. Copper takes its name from Cyprium, Latin for metal of Cyprus, a reflection of just how central the island's mines were to the ancient world's supply of this valuable, workable metal. Combined with tin from far more distant sources, this Cyprian copper became one half of the great alloy, bronze, that would go on to shape tools, weapons, and trade routes across the ancient Mediterranean for centuries. An entire small island carrying a metal patiently formed deep within the earth over unimaginable time, quietly lent its own name to something that would go on to shape human history far beyond its own modest shores. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Not every transformation in the ancient world required fire at all. Some of the quietest, most patient transformations happened instead inside a living creature, in complete darkness. When a small irritant, a grain of sand, a tiny parasite, becomes lodged inside certain mollusks, the creature responds by slowly coating the irritation in smooth, repeated layers of a substance called nacre, the same material that lines the inside of its shell. Layer by layer, over months or even years, this patient coating builds up around the original irritation until it becomes something smooth, luminous, and entirely transformed, a pearl. The alchemists searching so hard for their philosopher's stone might have found a strange kind of kinship here, in a small, unassuming creature quietly turning irritation into something lustrous, simply by refusing to stop, layer after patient layer. Whatever has been irritating you lately might, given enough gentle, patient time, be quietly coated into something smoother too. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. While the alchemists of Europe and the Middle East built their systems around 4 elements, a separate and equally old tradition developed in ancient China organized the world instead around 5. Wood, fire, earth, metal, and water formed the foundation of this system, understood not as static substances, but as dynamic forces, each one capable of generating or restraining another in a continuous, carefully balanced cycle. Wood feeds fire. Fire creates ash, which becomes earth. Earth holds metal within it. Metal, when it melts, can be thought of as flowing like water. And water, in turn, nourishes wood once again. This framework shaped not only Chinese alchemy and medicine, but architecture, cooking, and even statecraft, offering a way of understanding balance and change that didn't rely on opposition so much as gentle, continuous cycling from one state into the next. You don't need to resolve into some final, fixed state tonight either. You're allowed to simply keep cycling, gently, the way wood becomes fire, becomes ash, becomes earth, each one quietly feeding the next. High on certain volcanic slopes, ancient miners once climbed into thin, choking air to gather something the earth was quietly offering for free, pale yellow crystals, formed as volcanic gases cooled and solidified around vents in the rock. Sulfur gathered this way was traded across the ancient world for use in medicine, in dyeing, and eventually in the earliest gunpowder recipes, carried down steep, unstable slopes by workers who risked toxic fumes and treacherous footing for a substance the mountain itself had already patiently prepared, requiring no furnace or refinement at all. There's something almost startling in imagining a mountain quietly manufacturing something so useful entirely on its own timeline, simply by being volcanic, simply by existing exactly as it was, long before anyone climbed up to notice. Some of what you need most may already be sitting quietly nearby, prepared long before you arrived, waiting only to be gathered gently rather than forced into being. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. The very first hints that Earth's crust was not one single, fixed shell, but many separate, slowly drifting pieces, came not from dramatic discovery, but from a patient noticing of shapes, long before scientists understood the mechanism behind it. Some observers noticed how neatly the coastline of South America seemed to fit against the coastline of Africa, like two torn edges of a single page that had drifted slowly apart. It would take much more evidence, matching rock layers, matching ancient fossils found on now separated continents, before this quiet observation grew into the full understanding of plate tectonics. The continents had been drifting the entire time, of course, whether anyone noticed the matching edges or not. Truth doesn't wait for someone to notice it before it becomes real. It simply continues, patiently, until the noticing finally catches up. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. In the alchemist's careful sequence of stages, one step, sometimes called conjunction, involved the deliberate joining of two previously separated substances, believed necessary before any true transformation could be completed. This wasn't simply mixing, it required careful preparation beforehand. Each substance purified, refined, and made ready on its own, so that when the joining finally happened, it created something genuinely new, rather than a mere combination of two unchanged parts sitting side by side. The alchemists believed timing mattered enormously here. Too early, and the substances would resist each other, refusing to properly combine. At exactly the right moment, patiently arrived at, the two would join smoothly, becoming something neither could have been alone. Whatever separate, unsettled pieces of your day are still sitting quietly apart from each other tonight don't need to be forced together. Given a little more patient rest, they may simply settle into place on their own. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Very small and very quiet, this one. Long before it was burned in temples or carried by traders across deserts, frankincense began simply as sap, weeping slowly from cuts made in the bark of a hardy, unremarkable tree growing in dry, difficult soil. Left to harden slowly in open air, this resin became small, amber-colored droplets, gathered carefully by hand and carried, often across enormous distances, to be burned for its slow, fragrant smoke, valued in ancient trade routes as highly as gold or spice, prized in temples, in embalming, in medicine, simply because a tough little tree, growing in harsh conditions, patiently turned its own small wound into something worth carrying across the world. Even something born from a small injury, given enough patient time to harden and settle, can become something valuable enough to travel very far indeed. Once the young Earth's surface had finally cooled enough for water to exist as liquid rather than vapor, the sky itself seems to have opened. In what may have been the longest rainfall this planet has ever known. Scientists believe this early rain may have continued, almost without pause, for hundreds or even thousands of years. As water vapor thick in the atmosphere gradually condensed and fell, filling low basins across the cooling crust, layer by patient layer, until entire ancient ocean basins had gathered themselves into existence. It's difficult to imagine rain falling steadily for that long, longer than any human civilization has ever lasted, simply filling the world slowly and quietly from above, with no one anywhere to watch it happen, no window to look through, no roof to listen from. Whatever quiet, steady falling you feel resting over you tonight is only a tiny, gentle echo of something the earth itself once patiently endured for far, far longer. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. One particular alchemical pigment carried, quite literally, both of the two great symbolic principles inside a single stone. Cinnabar, a bright red mineral, is made of mercury bound together with sulfur. The very same two substances alchemists believed combined deep within the earth to form every metal in existence. When ground into fine powder, cinnabar produced a brilliant red pigment called vermilion, prized for centuries in painting, in seals, and in sacred texts, its brightness unmatched by almost anything else available at the time. There's something quietly fitting in the fact that mercury and sulfur, the two principles the alchemists spent so much energy trying to understand and combine in their furnaces, had already been quietly joined together by the earth itself, resting patiently in ordinary rock long before anyone thought to go looking. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. One of the very last, now. Deep beneath certain hillsides, water carrying a faint trace of dissolved acid slowly, patiently dissolves its way through solid limestone, hollowing out spaces that can take thousands of years to become a single cave. Inside those quiet hollows, that same water, dripping with agonizing slowness from the ceiling, leaves behind tiny mineral traces each time, building stalactites downward and stalagmites upward, one almost imperceptible layer at a time, sometimes growing no more than the width of a hair over an entire human lifetime. There is no rush anywhere in that process. No cave has ever tried to finish itself quickly. It simply continues, drop by patient drop, trusting entirely in the slow accumulation of time to eventually shape something whole. You can trust that slowness tonight too. Now, gently, let the pace of things begin to slow even further. The alchemists believed that transformation could never be rushed. Every stage required its own patient span of time. Nothing important was ever hurried in their furnaces. Nothing important needs to be hurried in you tonight, either. Let the facts begin to blur now, softly, at the edges. Let them settle, like dust after a long day of movement, finally allowed to rest on still ground. You don't need to hold onto any of it. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Just one more, small and quiet. Deep beneath your feet, the earth is still slowly cooling, even now. It has been cooling patiently for 4.5 billion years. It is in no hurry. Neither are you. Your mind is, in its own way, a quiet kind of alchemist too, always working, always trying to turn the raw material of your day into something it can finally understand, some settled shape it can rest inside. That's simply what a tired mind does. It isn't broken. It's just still working, gently, the way a furnace glows long after the flame beneath it has been allowed to lower. You don't need to finish that work tonight. You can let it lower now too. Let it lower and cool and settle. You can let all of this soften into impression now. The gold, the lead, the rivers, the rock, none of it needs to be held on too tightly. It was only ever meant to give your mind something soft to rest against, while your body remembered quietly how to let go. Let your breathing slow again, the way it did at the very beginning of tonight. Let your shoulders soften once more, a little further this time than before. Let your jaw loosen, your hands rest open, your whole body grow heavier. The way rock settles slowly into the shape it will hold for a very long time. Above you, right now, the same steady universe the alchemists once studied by candlelight is still quietly turning. Same old moon born from collision is still hanging patiently in the dark, still gently pulling at tides somewhere far away. The same ancient core deep beneath you is still slowly cooling, unhurried, exactly as it has been for billions of years. None of it needs you to stay awake for it. It will keep turning, keep cooling, keep settling long after you've drifted off, and it will still be there, just as steady when you wake. So let go now. Let the furnace lower. Let the metal cool. Let the rock settle. Let the tide ease back. Your body already knows how to rest. Sleep well, and good night.